and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books, out loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It is Little Blue Book number 1723, and it is titled The Amazing Career of Al Capone. And it is written by Leah Gregg. Now I think this one was written in the early 30s, because it mentions different dates in the 20s as being past tense. So this is part 2 of this book, and we start off in chapter 7. The big three were now dissolved into one. Capone was left to reign supreme, but not without contention. To accomplish its purpose, gangland must be organized, and its organization must be closely knit to remain consistently invulnerable. Ordinary cops can make arrests rather indiscriminately, but the coppers at headquarters have to be more careful. They depend on the politicians and office holders for their jobs. The politicians and office holders depend largely on the unions who vote as one at the polls, and the unions are largely controlled by gangland. In the Teamsters unions, in the street sweepers unions, in the theater and building janitors unions, there is power personified. The strength of the organization is partly explained by its racial characteristics. It is Sicilian. Sicilians stick together. Following Merlot's death, Angelo Genna of the Six Brothers assumed the role of president. Capone's time, just then, was largely taken up by the O'Banions, who were out to get him, and to seeing that things were running smoothly in Cicero and his beer territory. The Jennas were aspiring chaps, and they felt that old Dame Fortune was at last knocking at their door. The Jennas had long seen to alky cooking for the combine. Their methods were both simple and profitable. Early in the game, they had obtained a permit from the government for an alcohol manufacturing plant, but they soon learned that the output here was far less than the demand. A demand so easily increased. It was then that the poor Sicilian families were introduced to alky cooking. When the plan was working in full swing, there were about 15,000 flats sheltering the operations of 15,000 stills. A man visited each of the flats every day, bringing supplies for that day's work and collecting the distillation of the day before. He left $15 in the hand of a well-pleased Sicilian. When a flat was raided, the distiller notified the delivery man, and he saw to it that operations were quickly resumed. Lombardo had been Capone's choice as Merlot's predecessor, but the Genoas were determined to establish themselves in the Union A. It was not as difficult as it might seem at first. Remember those 15,000 tiny flats that hid those stills? And hadn't the Genoa seen to it that the daily $15 was paid to the head of each family? Indeed they had. $15, and all that family had to do was sit at home, read the newspapers, and stoke the still. No, it wasn't difficult for Angelo Genna to become president of the Union A Sicilione. After all, Lombardi was just a commission broker and a cheese merchant. Angelo was the first Genoa and the first president of the Union A to be killed. 'Twas the same old story. A car drove alongside his, 3 gun muzzles spat out, and Angelo was erased. There followed the usual investigation, befuddled, as usual, by lack of evidence. Within the next 3 weeks, Mike Genna got his. He was riding in company with Salice and Anselmi, Capone's ace gunners, when a detective squad touring the 47th Street district recognized Genna and determined to see what he and his friends were about. The gangster's car refused to stop at a signal from the squad car. A chase and battle followed that ended in the death of Mike Genna, gangster, and Olson and Walsh, police officers. Scalise and Salimi were doubtless taking Mike for a ride. Little matter, though. A cop finished him off. Antonio Smartest of the Jennas was the next to get it. A killer, Spano by name, whom the Jennas had imported in 1921, telephoned Antonio, asking him to meet him at Grand and Curtis Street. Antonio went, while Spano clasped his hands and murmured, "My friend." Antonio was shot in the back. This was enough for the Jennas. The remaining three skipped the country. In the face of all the Jenna bloodshed, Samoots Amatuna was not discouraged. Samoots had been a Jenna payoff man in the old Alki cooking days, and with the fall of the Jennas, he was sure his chances to clean up on the cash had come. He lost no time in assembling what remained of the old Jenna gang, entered the Union A with a display of firearms, and declared himself president. But Samoots didn't last long. He was shot as he sat in a barber's chair, getting a shave and a manicure. He died of lead poisoning. Lombardo, the man of Capone's choice, was at last placed in the president's chair of the mighty Unione Sicilione. Lombardo lasted longer than those who had preceded him. It was to Capone's advantage to keep him alive. But late one autumn afternoon in 1928, he went a-walking with his bodyguard, Joseph Laredo and Joseph Ferrero. They made their way through a crowded street in the Loop, hands fondling the guns in their pockets. Shots were fired from behind them. Lombardo fell, bullets in his brain. Ferrero was hit in the spine and lay paralyzed. Lillardo pursued the assassins, who had been walking directly behind the Capone trio. However, his pursuit was interrupted by a policeman who was positive he had captured the killer. The usual official investigation followed, but no one could identify the assassins. No one had any idea who was responsible. Pasqualino Lillardo, elder brother of Joseph, was the next president of the Union A. 4 months later, he drank his toast to death. He had just returned from a shopping tour with his wife. As they got out of the car in front of their home, Lillardo was met by two men, both of whom accepted his invitation to come into his apartment. They talked for a half hour, and then they left. About 5 minutes later, the Lillardo doorbell rang, and Lillardo himself admitted and welcomed three men. He set food and drink before them, then closed the living room door. At the end of an hour, one of the three guests proposed a toast. "Here's to Pasqualino." But instead of merry tinkle of glass, there was a shot, followed by a deadly thud. The Moran gang suspected an investigation, insufficient evidence. Joseph Guiente, imported from New York during the Lombardo reign, was assumed the responsibility of telling Little Italy what it was to do and how it was to vote. But Joe got his big ideas, thought he'd show the big boy a thing or two. Joe and the homicide squad, Scalise and Ensimi, made their departure together. The three sat at one end of a jolly banquet table in a roadhouse near Hammond, Indiana. Guests of honor. They were Joe sitting between Al's two ace gunners. In the midst of the merriment, guns roared, and it was the end of the president of the Union A of Death, and the homicide squad. There is a story that these three had formed an alliance and were making plans that jeopardized the Capone dynasty. Joe Elio succeeded Guente. Joe had been a former partner of Tony Lombardo's. Yes, they had been in the cheese business together. The cheese business, however, wasn't nearly as fascinating nor so ruminative as the presidency of the Unione Sicilione. Joe was jealous and aspiring. Being the head of a Sicilian clan, by virtue of belonging to a large family, wedging in was less difficult. He began by organizing the Sicilians outside of Chicago and St. Louis especially. The old Genoa gang was reassembled in Chicago, and Bugs Moran, Skidmore, Berchetti, and Jack Zuda were all taken in. They offered a chef $10,000 to put prussic acid in Al's soup. The chef got scared and squealed. Then they offered $50,000 to the man who could prove he had killed Capone. This bunch was after big game. They meant to get the Scarface. Capone still walks about, but 4 men strange to Chicago Badland were found murdered, and following these, 6 from the old Genoa forces. Along about the same time, the police unearthed a machine gun nest planted opposite Lombardo's home at 4442 Washington Boulevard, and another in the Loop across from one of Capone's favorite loafing places. When questioned, La Montillo, a Milwaukee gunman, admitted that he had been hired by Eliello to kill Lombardo and Capone. Eliello was brought to the Detective Bureau to be questioned. He had not been there an hour when someone, looking out a window, saw 6 taxis on the opposite side of the street discharging about 25 men. Louis Campanaglia was recognized. "It's the Capone gang," the watcher cried. The Detective Bureau had been surrounded. 2 policemen rushed out and grabbed Campanaglia, Frank Perry, and Samuel Marcus of Capone's bodyguard. 2 guns were found on Campanaglia and Perry, but only one was taken from Marcus. In a moment he whipped out a second gun from the inside of his shirt, but was overpowered before he had a chance to shoot his way out. The 3 Capone men were placed in a cell next to the one occupied by Aiello. An officer was disguised and planted as an eavesdropper. He heard Aiello plead, "Can't we fix it up?" 3 men laughed. "You started this," they replied. "You dirty rat, you're as good as dead." Aiello lived more than a year after that, but he was on the spot, and he died the usual gangster's death. Presidents of the Unione Siciliane, or the Italo-American Union as it is called today, one by one faced the guns, but that does not detract from the savor of the position of the Sicilian. It means power and prestige to him, which must be, in his estimation, far greater than life. Chapter 8. When Al saw Lombardo securely seated in the presidential chair of the Unione, he was confident things in that quarter would run smoothly enough, and he was preparing to devote his attention to the troublesome O'Banions, now directed by Jaime Weiss, and intent upon avenging Dion's death. Jaime set up headquarters above O'Banion's floral shop and began his work. Before Torrio was shot down in front of his home, Capone's Cadillac had been sent to the junk heap. He had just been inspecting his beer territory and had stopped in a restaurant outside of which his car was parked. A touring car, being driven very slowly, passed, riddling the body and engine with bullets fired from machine guns and sawed-off shotguns. The chauffeur, shot in the back, dropped to the floor and escaped additional injuries. Twice now the O'Banions, headed by Weiss, had invaded Capone-Torrio territory. The third time was dramatic in the extreme, but entirely void of charm. Al and Frank Rio, one of the bodyguards, and his constant companion, sat in the Hawthorne Cafe, leisurely drinking their coffee. It was just a little after 1 in the afternoon. They had taken the usual precautions, sitting at a rear table and facing the door, but they didn't look as if they were expecting trouble when the sound of a machine gun came to their ears. Everyone lay flat on the floor. The car from which the shots came past, the restaurant, was gone. There was quiet. Al started for the door, but before he had taken a single step, Rio was on top of him. Looking down into Al's slightly astonished face, Frank said, "Don't do it, boss. The real stuff hasn't started. It's a stall to get you out." Frank was right. About a block behind the first car, whose gun had fired blanks, 7 other cars followed about 10 feet apart. They didn't open fire until they were directly opposite Capone's headquarters. There they stopped and then let loose. Out of the sixth car, a man coolly descended carrying a Thompson submachine gun. Composedly he walked to the door leading to the lobby of the Hawthorne Hotel, squatted, took aim, fired. Finished, he rose and unhurriedly returned to his car. The last car did not participate in the battle, but the men in it were equipped with sawed-off shotguns and maintained a close watch over the gunner as he knelt on the sidewalk. At the signal, the 7 cars moved away rapidly. Not long after the bombardment on Cicero, a young man rented a room at 740 North State Street, right next door to Wise's headquarters. He wanted the front room, but finding it occupied, he took a back one until the front room was vacated. Then he moved in. From the front window there was an angling view of the front door of the flower shop. About the same time, a young woman rented a room at number 1 Superior Street, which commanded a view of the shop's back door. 3 men, one by one, quietly drifted into each of these rooms. 3 men in each room quietly lifted their instruments from their violin cases. But they weren't instruments to play the soft strains of a Schubert serenade. They were to play the death dance for little Jaime Weiss. There was no hurry. No one knew how long the vigil was kept. Perhaps no one will ever know. But one afternoon, little Jaime fell with 10 bullets in his body. Patrick Murray, one of his beer peddlers, fell beside him with 7 bullet wounds. W. O'Brien, a criminal lawyer, Benjamin Jacobs, a politician, and Sam Peller, Weiss's chauffeur, were shot down, but lived. Chapter 9. Yep. It was just about 8 o'clock one evening in April when McSwiggan, Dougherty, Miles, O'Donnell, Duffy, and Edward Hanley, Dotterly's chauffeur, stopped in front of Harry Madigan's saloon. Madigan was a saloon keeper in Capone's territory, who was buying beer from the Weiss faction. The supposition was that they were about to drop in on Harry for a few social drinks, but McSwiggan, Duffy, and Daughtry were never to reach the door. They were fatally wounded by a stream of machine gun slugs fired from a car that had sneaked up alongside theirs. A special prosecutor was assigned to conduct the investigation, and Capone was sought for questioning. Al wasn't to be found. Newspapers proclaimed that a secret warrant was issued for Al Capone, charging him with murder. Almost 4 months passed before Capone was with counsel. Attorney Thomas D. Nash, appeared before the Chief Justice, Thomas J. Lynch, of the Criminal Court. The case was dismissed because the charges had been made on cursory information and belief. Weiss, out of the way, and Moran and Drucy lacking strength to rally the old O'Banion bunch, Capone's supremacy in the North was undisputed. His power in the West was absolute, and he had control as far south as Chicago Heights. Old Pollock Joe Saltus was scared. He had double-crossed Al. Saltus and his bodyguard, Lefty Conchill, was on trial for the murder of Mitters Foley. Dingbat O'Berty had been indicted on the same charge, but granted a separate trial. At the death of Jaime Weiss, papers were disclosed showing that little Jaime had raised a $100,000 defense fund for Joe. Things certainly looked bad. Miles and Klondike O'Donnell weren't exactly easy in their shoes. Drucy and Moran were wondering what was going to happen next. Dingbat O'Berta realized the situation was precarious and that something had to be done, and done quickly. He also knew that whatever was done had to have brains back at it. He sent for Maxie Eisen, fish market racketeer, reputed to be the smartest guy in Chicago's underworld, even smarter than Jack Guzik, Capone's big brain man. Maxie, personally eager for peace, promised O'Berta and the others to see what he could do to bring about a declaration against further bloodshed. He saw Capone, who was also tired of the constant fight. So it was arranged that they should meet, all of these gangsters, at the Hotel Sherman on October 20th, 1926, to see if they couldn't get together. Gangland met that day without its guns and active bodyguard. It wasn't hard to determine who the big shot in the bootlegging game was. Al Capone dictated the terms of the peace pact, and those terms were accepted without a murmur. But it may be added, there was little opportunity for whispers as the terms were agreeably generous. For 2 months there was not a single shot heard. Then Lefty Conchill, Saltus henchman, and Big Hayes Hawbrick, member of the Saltus crowd, were killed in an auto ambush, slayers not apprehended. Old Joe now ran back into his hole and stayed there. Chapter 10. Drusi was killed the day before his election in 1927, but Capone didn't do it. He was killed by a copper who was taking him to the detective bureau to meet his attorney after he had been arrested for participation in a pre-election gun battle. Drusi's attorney tried to have the officer Healy arrested, charged with murder, but he didn't get far. Old Shoe's chief of detective William Shoemaker said, "I know Drusi was killed trying to take a gun away from an officer. We're having a medal made for Healy." Chapter 11. There was nothing about the SMC Cartage Company in Hayer's garage that suggested tragedy. It was apparently just another furniture-moving concern on Clark Street, one of Chicago's busiest thoroughfares. The SMC Cartage Company was Bugs Moran's headquarters. There were trucks all right, but these trucks were not used for transporting furniture. No, these trucks were used to haul beer. Bugs was getting ready for a big rum-running expedition, the biggest he had attempted since Al had taken up residence in his Florida villa. The trucks and cars were in readiness for the haul, which was to start at noon on February 14th, 1929. The night before, late, Moran received a telephone call from a hijacker who said he had just succeeded in getting a truckload of good liquor en route from Detroit to Chicago. Bugs evidently knew the man who telephoned, for the deal was quickly made. "Deliver it to the garage at 10:30 tomorrow morning. All the boys will be there. We're short, and they'll want a cut." And Bugs thought the deal was as good as closed. At 10:30 that St. Valentine's morning, sitting in the back of a garage were Frank and Pete Gusenberg, John May, safe blower, Al Weinshank, speakeasy proprietor, James Clark, bank robber, suspect, Adam Hare, and the youthful Dr. Schwimmer, optometrist. Here they were, all dressed up and waiting for Moran, Marks, and Newberry, and the load of hijacked liquor. Moran, Marks, and Newberry, coming down the street, saw a Cadillac touring car, equipped like a detective squad car, draw up a short distance before their headquarters, saw 3 plainclothes men and 2 uniformed policemen alight and enter their hangout. Coppers, they concluded, and decided to wander about a bit until things quieted down. This decision saved their lives. The 2 men in uniform confronted Moran's men, who figured it was just another police raid, and commanded them to line up against the wall while they were disarmed. They complied without protest. At a signal from one of the men in uniform, the men in civilian clothes entered. One was equipped with a Thompson submachine gun, the other with a 12-gauge double-barreled shotgun. The third man remained just outside. The machine gun did the work. The firing probably lasted no more than 10 seconds, and 7 lives were taken, without the victims fully realizing what was up. Coming out of the garage, the men in police uniforms hid the guns under their coats and walked behind the men in plain clothes, who held their hands high above their heads. Chance overseers concluded that an arrest had been made. When Moran heard what had happened, he blustered, "Only Capone kills like that." "No wonder they call him Bugs," commented Al, when he heard what Bugs had said. 3 weeks passed before any clues were developed. 3 men, Joseph Laredo, Fred Berkey, and James Ray, were named as participants. Jack Guzik, Capone's business manager, they discovered had been holding daily long-distance telephone conversations with Al, who was in Florida. Money had been sent on the investigation of the Moran gang massacre. There have been suspects, but as far as the world at large is concerned, it is still an unsolved mystery. Chapter 12. "Play High Schneider in the third," a man shouted to Jake Lingle, Tribune police reporter, as he bought a racing form just before entering the subway entrance to the Randolph Street, Illinois Central Station. He waved his hand in recognition, but without stopping went on down the steps leading to the subway passage, his racing sheet spread before him. As he passed a newsstand in the subway, someone stuck a short-barreled belly gun at the back of his neck and fired. Jack fell forward. Pandemonium followed. The subway was crowded, and people went wild with excitement. These are those who have since wondered if the man who shouted to Lingle just before his descent into the subway didn't give the signal of death. But that's only supposition. Another theory is that at least a dozen men covered the killer's getaway. But why should Jake Lingle, leg reporter for the Tribune, working for $65 a week, die a gangster's death? Colonel Robert R. McCormick, publisher of the Chicago Tribune, had no idea what the investigation he started would reveal. At first they thought it was a Capone job, but later they discovered Jake was a close friend of Capone and Police Commissioner William Russell, and had for years been handling and spending large sums of money. Following Lingle's murder, a number of killings occurred. Vengeance was in the air. Then, the reason for the Lingle shooting came to light. Jake had accepted $25,000 from Jack Zuda, a Lelio ally, and who later died the death, at a summer resort in Wisconsin. This money was Jake's pay to smooth the road for dog racing, to be promoted by Zuda at the Chicago Stadium. The fix, however, didn't work, and Zuda wanted his money back. Lingle had spent the $25,000 and couldn't raise the cash. Zuda just became impatient. That's all. One day a tip-off man, hot from Capone, came to the Tribune investigators, who were acting more or less independently of the authorities. Would they like to know who really killed Lingle? There was a short conversation, and the Tribune men were put on the trail of Leo Brothers, a St. Louis gangster with a long police record. He was captured and tried, and now receives his mail in Joliet. Chapter 13. There are those who believe that Capone took the rap in the Pennsylvania penitentiary because he was tired and wanted to get a night's sleep with the certainty that he'd wake up the next morning. He was sentenced to a year and served 10 months. It couldn't have been such a hard life at that. Al furnished his cell to suit himself. There was a rug on the floor, easy chairs, and he had unlimited telephone privileges. His work was not unpleasant, and his fellow prisoners liked him. He gave them over $1,000 worth of presents and donated more than $1,000 to the Pennsylvania orphanage. When the time neared for his release, he was taken away from the prison 24 hours ahead of schedule, so that he might avoid the crowd that was certain to be waiting at the gates to catch a glimpse of Chicago's bad man. Chapter 14. Capone's whole career was not only a grave personal mistake, but it became a national scandal as well. There were forces at work trying to topple him from his pedestal, and when these at last realized that neither Chicago, Cook County, nor the state of Illinois could handle him, they invoked the aid of the United States government. The federal men quietly and gladly took over the job of uncovering the idol of gangland's feet of clay. First of all, Capone was sentenced to 6 months by federal judge James H. Wilkerson for refusing to leave Florida and come to Chicago to be tried on a charge of income tax evasion. The gangster's physician certified that Al was too sick to travel, but Judge Wilkerson immediately recognized this for what it was, a subterfuge and an indirect defiance of his authority, and held Capone in contempt of court. Then came the income tax evasion trial. Previous to this, Capone's attorney came to an agreement with the government's prosecutor. Capone was to plead guilty, thus saving the expense of a lengthy trial, the outcome of which might easily be unfavorable to the government. In return, he was not to be questioned and not to receive more than a nominal sentence. Judge Wilkerson promptly punctured this agreement by refusing to recognize it. The government cannot be bound by agreements made by its agents. The defendant must stand trial. Capone was found guilty on 5 counts. Income tax evasion 1925, tax evasion 1926, tax evasion 1927, and 2 counts of failing to file returns for the years 1928 and 1929. His sentence was 11 years in prison and a $50,000 fine. Says the New York Times of October 25, 1931, speaking of how he took the various sentences, Capone tried to smile, but the smile came out a queer twist. And again, Capone jiggled a little and his jaw worked. He licked his lips. And speaking of the actual jailing, what do you say, Al? A reporter asked him. Capone? Waiting for his cell assignment. I have anything to say? No, I haven't anything to say. He smiled a sickly smile, hesitated, and said, well, you can say I decided to get through with it. As the turnkey opened his cell door, he hurled his topcoat in ahead of him. The door clanged. And that is the end of Little Blue Book number 1723, titled The Amazing Career of Al Capone, written by Leah Gregg. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you with the next book.